The hiss of the comms was a nest of angry snakes. Static crackled over the desperate words tumbling from the speaker in the Tactical Operations Center. Reaper 3 is pinned. I repeat, we are pinned down at grid coordinate 497. Archer is down. I say again, Archer is Kia. We're taking effective fire from 3, maybe 4 positions. We can't move. The voice was young, frayed by panic and the thin, screaming air of the Sharkawi Range. Colonel Marcus Thorne stood before the massive holographic map, his shadow a stark, unmoving monolith against the cool blue light of the projected terrain. He was a man carved from granite and procedure, and his face was a mask of controlled fury. "What's the status of the extraction, Bird?" he barked, his voice cutting through the low hum of the TOC. "Pedro 6-1 is on standby at FOB Dagger, sir," a communications tech answered, not daring to look up from her console. "But the weather cell is moving in fast. They've got a 20-minute window max. And it's closing." Thorne's jaw tightened. A captured asset, a pinned pararescue team, and a sandstorm birthed in the devil's own lungs. It was a trifecta of failure. "Who is Reaper's Overwatch?" "Archer was their DM, sir. Their designated marksman. He was the Overwatch." A vein pulsed in Thorne's temple. "Understood. Tell Pedro 6-1 to hold their position. I'm not sending a rescue bird into a meat grinder without long-range support. Find me a sniper team. I want a ghost unit spun up yesterday." On the tarmac of FOB Dagger, the wind was already a physical presence, a gritty whip that tasted of dust and distance. It tore at the canvas covers and screamed around the rotors of the HH-60G Pave Hawk. Callsign Pedro 6-1. Inside the cabin, Captain Anya Sharma methodically checked the seals on a plasma cooler. Her movements were economical, precise, devoid of any wasted energy. At 36, she was the flight nurse, a figure of quiet competence in a world of loud, kinetic energy. Her flight suit was immaculate, her dark hair pulled back in a severe, functional bun. She was an island of calm in the growing storm of radio chatter and whipping sand. The crew chief, Sergeant Leo Diaz, a young PJ barely out of his 20s, watched her from the open door. He'd flown with her for 6 months. She rarely spoke unless it was about a patient's vitals or a medical procedure. Yet, there was a stillness to her, an unnerving focus that seemed out of place. He saw the other PJs, hardened operators themselves, give her a wide berth. They joked about her, calling her the librarian or stat sheet Sharma. They saw a medic, a woman who dealt in blood bags and bandages. Diaz saw something else. He saw the way her eyes constantly scanned the horizon, not with idle curiosity, but with a deep, analytical patience. He saw the way she moved, with a predator's balance, even in the bucking belly of the helicopter. The pilot's voice, tight with frustration, crackled over the internal comms. "TOC has us on a leash. Thorne won't clear us for ingress without a dedicated marksman." Archer bought it. One of the other PJs, a man named Griggs, spat a stream of tobacco juice onto the tarmac. "So we just sit here while Reaper gets turned into paste? Command can go to hell." "Stow it, Griggs," the pilot snapped. "It's the colonel's call." Diaz looked at Sharma. She hadn't reacted, her hands still moving over the medical packs, securing straps, checking gauges. It was as if the conversation, the fate of the men trapped in the mountains, was happening in another world. This detachment, which the others interpreted as coldness, struck Diaz as something else entirely. Control. Absolute, unshakable control. The kind you only learned in places far worse than this. The frantic voice from Reaper 3 came over the comms again, this time weaker, laced with the flat tone of resignation. "They're setting up a mortar. We don't have much time." The transmission ended in a burst of static. The silence that followed was heavier than any sound. Colonel Thorne slammed his fist on the central console, making the comms tech flinch. "Where is my sniper team? I need rifles on that ridge 5 minutes ago." "Sir, the closest ghost unit is 40 minutes out. Best case." His operations sergeant major reported, his voice grim. The storm front will have that entire valley socked in by then. Pedro 6-1 is the only asset that can get there in time. And I told you, Thorne seethed, turning his glare on the man. I will not authorize a casualty evacuation flight into a prepared ambush without overwatch. It's suicide. We will lose the bird, the crew, and any chance of recovering Reaper. Protocol exists for a reason. He was a man who believed in rules, in the mathematical certainty of doctrine. Doctrine said you didn't fly into a hot landing zone without fire superiority. The pilot of Pedro 6-1, Chief Warrant Officer Mills, keyed his mic, his voice a low, insistent drawl that belied the urgency. Colonel, with all due respect, Reaper doesn't have 40 minutes. They barely have 10. We can use the leading edge of the storm for cover. Get in, get them out. It's risky, but it's their only shot. Negative, Pedro 6-1. Thorne's voice was ice. Your orders are to hold. Do you copy? There was a pause. We copy, sir, Mills said, the words tasting like ash. Holding. Inside the helicopter, the crew sat in simmering rage. Griggs kicked a loose strap on the floor. Holding? We're holding their death warrants. Diaz watched Sharma. She had finally stopped her work. She stood motionless, her head tilted slightly as if listening to a frequency no one else could hear. Then she turned to him. Her eyes were dark, devoid of panic, but filled with an intensity that made the breath catch in his throat. Sergeant Diaz, she said, her voice calm and even. Where is Sergeant Archer's rifle case? The question was so out of place, so bizarre, that Diaz just stared for a second. It's secured in the aft compartment. Why? The men on that mountain need a marksman, she stated, not as a suggestion, but as a fact. And command is 40 minutes away. Griggs let out a short, derisive laugh. What are you going to do, Captain? Bandage the enemy to death. The other PJs snickered. The tension was thick, and the medic's strange declaration was an easy target for their frustration. Sharma's gaze shifted to Griggs. It wasn't angry. It was cold, appraising, like a geologist studying a rock. Something like that, she said softly. Mill's voice cut in over the internal comms, directed at the cabin. Did I hear that right? What's going on back there? The captain's got a hero complex, Griggs grumbled. Thinks she's gonna play sniper. Enough, Sharma said. The word was quiet, yet it carried the weight of absolute authority. The laughter died instantly. She looked at Diaz again. The case, Sergeant. Diaz found himself moving before he'd even made a conscious decision to. He unlatched the aft compartment and pulled out the heavy Pelican case. It was stenciled with Archer's name and the designation M110A1 SAS. A 762mm beast of a rifle, precise and unforgiving. He laid it on the floor. The other PJs watched, their mockery replaced by a stunned curiosity. This wasn't in any manual they'd ever read. Colonel Thorne paced the TOC like a caged tiger. He was trapped between his rigid adherence to the rules that had kept men alive for 30 years and the gut-wrenching certainty that those same rules were about to kill Reaper 3. Give me an update on the mortar fire, he demanded. Intermittent, sir, the tech replied. They're ranging. It's only a matter of time before they walk one right into their position. And the asset? No visual confirmation. Reaper reports he's still alive, but they can't get to him. Thorne closed his eyes, the blue glow of the map painting ghoulish shadows on his face. He was sending good men to die because the right piece wasn't on the board. A medic wanting to play hero was just another layer of chaos he didn't need. Pedro 6-1, he transmitted, his voice hard. Give me a sit rep on your crew. Is everyone maintaining mission focus? It was a warning, a clear signal to Mills to get his people in line. Mills paused for a long moment before replying. Sir, my crew is focused on the mission. The mission is saving Reaper 3. We're ready to execute on your command. He chose his words carefully, a subtle act of defiance. The message was clear, we are ready. The delay is on you. Thorne heard the unspoken accusation and his jaw clenched even tighter. He was the one holding the leash. He would also be the one to answer for the bodies. Anya Sharma knelt on the vibrating deck of the Pave Hawk. With a series of deft clicks, she opened the rifle case. Inside, nestled in custom-cut foam, lay the M110A1. It was a weapon built for a singular purpose, a tool of surgical violence. The others watched in a thick, expectant silence. They expected her to be clumsy, hesitant. They expected a nurse fumbling with a warrior's instrument. They were wrong. Her hands moved with a familiar, ingrained grace. There was no hesitation. She lifted the rifle, the weight settling into her shoulders as if it were a missing part of her. Her fingers brushed over the cold steel of the receiver, the worn texture of the pistol grip. It was a reunion. She checked the chamber, her movements fluid and efficient. She slid the bolt forward, the sound a solid, satisfying chunk of machined steel locking into place. She picked up a magazine, tested the spring with her thumb, and then slid it into the mag well with a firm click that echoed in the tense cabin. Diaz's eyes were wide. He'd been through countless weapons training courses. He had seen Special Forces operators, Rangers, and Marine Scout snipers handle their rifles. They all had a certain rhythm, a practiced economy of motion. Sharma's was different. It was quieter, more intimate. It was as if the weapon was not a tool in her hands, but an extension of her will. She attached the suppressor, twisting it on with a quiet rasp of metal threads. Then she checked the optics, a high-powered variable scope. She didn't put her eye to it. Instead, she just looked at the knobs, her fingers hovering over the windage and elevation turrets, a pianist contemplating a complex piece of music. On the sleeve of her flight suit, just below the captain's bars, was a small, almost unnoticeable patch. It was a single raven's feather, rendered in faded, subdued thread. Diaz had seen it before but thought it was a personal memento. Now it seemed like something else. A symbol, a warning. "Mills," she said, her voice calm and clear over the comms, cutting through the tension. "When you get us there, I need a stable platform. As stable as you can make it." The pilot, who had been listening to the entire exchange with a mixture of disbelief and dawning hope, responded instantly. "You got it, Captain. Just tell me what you need." There was no more skepticism in his voice. The confidence in hers had erased it completely. She slung the rifle over her shoulder and began securing herself to the gunner's harness by the open cabin door. Griggs just stared, his mouth slightly agape. Where did you learn to do that?" he asked, the words barely a whisper. Sharma paused and looked at him. Her eyes were unreadable. "My grandfather," she said simply. "He taught me how to read the wind." She offered no other explanation. She didn't need to. The quiet certainty in her voice was more convincing than any war story. She pulled a single, custom-loaded round from a small pouch on her belt. It was heavier than the standard issue. The brass was polished to a dull sheen. She worked the bolt, ejected the standard round that had been in the chamber, and replaced it with her own. A single, special bullet for a special problem. She was ready. Mills made his decision. To hell with the colonel. To hell with protocol. His men were dying on that mountain. "TOC, this is Pedro 6-1, he said, his voice level and hard. "We are commencing our approach. Comms may be intermittent due to terrain and weather." He didn't wait for a reply. He pitched the helicopter forward, the powerful engines screaming as the Pave Hawk leaped from the tarmac and banked hard toward the jagged peaks. He was risking his career, his wings, but leaving Reaper 3 to die was a price he was unwilling to pay. The flight into the Sharkawi Range was a controlled fall through chaos. Mills pushed the Pave Hawk to its limits, flying nap of the earth, a scant 50 feet above the rock-strewn desert floor. The sandstorm was a solid wall of churning brown ahead of them, a monster of grit and wind. He wasn't flying around it, he was flying into it. As they entered the first tendrils of the storm, the world outside the cockpit dissolved into a blinding maelstrom. The helicopter bucked and shuddered, thrown about by violent, unpredictable currents of air. Inside the cabin, it was a battle to stay upright. The PJs braced themselves, their knuckles white as they gripped handholds. The noise was deafening. The roar of the engines, the scream of the wind, and the constant, percussive rattle of sand and gravel striking the fuselage like a blast of cosmic buckshot. Through it all, Anya Sharma was a study in stillness. Tethered by the gunner's harness near the open door, she stood with her feet planted wide, her knees bent, absorbing the violent lurches of the aircraft as if she were rooted to the deck. The M110A1 was held in a low-ready position, its muzzle pointed safely toward the floor. Her eyes were closed. Diaz, strapped in across from her, watched in awe. She wasn't fighting the helicopter's motion. She was flowing with it. Her breathing was deep and rhythmic, a silent mantra against the storm's fury. He could feel the vibrations through the soles of his boots, a deep, jarring shudder that threatened to shake his teeth loose. Yet Sharma seemed to be in a different place, a pocket of serenity in the heart of the tempest. Entering the Serpent's Tooth, Mills announced over the comms, his voice strained from the effort of fighting the controls. The Serpent's Tooth was a narrow, winding canyon, a geological scar that offered the only semi-protected route to Reaper 3's position. It shielded them from the enemy's line of sight, but it was a pilot's nightmare. The canyon walls were a claustrophobic blur of red rock, close enough to feel like they could reach out and touch them. The wind, funneled by the tight passage, became a howling, treacherous vortex. The Pave Hawk scraped and yawed, its rotors beating a desperate rhythm just feet from the unforgiving stone. Sharma opened her eyes. They were clear, focused. She leaned out into the open doorway, the wind tearing at her. A physical blow that would have staggered another person. She didn't flinch. She held a small, simple instrument in her hand. A kestrel, a handheld weather meter. She wasn't looking at the canyon walls. She was reading the air. She watched the way the dust devils danced and died, how the streams of sand flowed over the rock ledges. She was mapping the invisible currents, memorizing the language of the wind in this specific, deadly place. This wasn't just a flight. It was an environmental study conducted at 200 knots. 2 minutes to the extraction point, the co-pilot called out. Breaking out of the canyon, as they cleared the final bend, the world opened up into a cauldron of rock and fire. Below them lay a small, bowl-shaped valley, already choked with the haze of the approaching storm. Pinpricks of muzzle flashes erupted from the surrounding ridges, all directed at a small outcropping of boulders where the last 2 members of Reaper 3 were making their stand. Tracers, green and deadly, stitched lines across the valley floor. The sharp crack of incoming rounds was now audible even over the engine's roar. Mills brought the helicopter into a high orbit, a circling pattern 1,000 meters above the firefight. It was a terrifyingly exposed position. "I can't get any lower," he yelled over the comms. "They've got heavy machine guns on the high ground. They'll tear us apart." "Hold this orbit," Sharma's voice replied, cutting through the noise. It was utterly calm. She unslung the rifle. "Diaz, get on the optics. Talk to me." Diaz scrambled to the pintle-mounted M240 machine gun, not to fire it, but to use its powerful spotting scope. He swung it toward the ridge, his heart hammering against his ribs. I've got a machine gun nest. Northeast ridge. Dug in behind some rocks. Range, 800 meters, maybe more." Sharma didn't look through her scope yet. She just stood in the doorway, the rifle resting easily in her grip, feeling the wind on her face. She could feel the subtle shifts in the helicopter's altitude, the yaw and pitch as Mills fought to keep it steady. "Wind is gusting from 2 o'clock, she said, more to herself than to anyone else. "Updraft from the valley floor. Temperatures dropping." She raised the rifle to her shoulder. The movement was a single, fluid piece of art. She settled the stock into the pocket of her shoulder, her cheek finding the stock weld as if by magnetic attraction. The world outside, the chaos, the noise, the fear, it all vanished. Her world shrank to the circular view through the scope, the fine lines of the reticle, and the rhythm of her own breathing. Diaz watched through his own scope, his feed displayed on a small screen for the pilots. He saw the enemy gunner, a dark shape behind the squat, ugly form of a DSHK heavy machine gun. The man was firing with impunity, chewing up the rocks around Reaper's position. Target confirmed, Diaz said, his voice tight. No way. The wind's too strong. The bird's unstable. In Sharma's scope, the crosshairs drifted lazily across the target. She wasn't fighting the helicopter's movement. She was incorporating it into her calculations. Inhale. The reticle dipped. Exhale. It rose. The helicopter yawed left. She compensated. She was timing the shot to coincide with the apex of the helicopter's orbit, the single, fleeting moment of relative stability. She let out half a breath and held it. Her finger rested on the trigger. The world slowed to a crawl. She saw the wind push a plume of dust from the ridge. She saw the flicker of the muzzle flash from the enemy gun. She saw the space between heartbeats. Time stopped. Her finger squeezed the trigger. The rifle bucked against her shoulder, a firm, familiar push. The sound was a sharp crack, swallowed almost instantly by the roar of the engines and the wind. For a moment, nothing happened. The distance was so great that the bullet's flight was a measurable passage of time. Diaz held his breath, thinking she'd missed. Then, 800 meters away, the enemy gunner's head snapped back with impossible violence. His helmet flew off, and he collapsed sideways, a limp puppet whose strings had been cut. The heavy machine gun fell silent. A stunned silence filled the helicopter. It lasted for 2 seconds, an eternity in a firefight. Then Griggs' voice, full of disbelief, came over the comms. Jesus Christ, did you see that? Did you see that shot? In the TOC, Colonel Thorne stared at the drone feed, a grainy, top-down view of the battle. He saw the machine gun stop firing. What was that? Who took out that gun? He demanded. Mill's voice came back over the comms, and for the first time, there was a note of pure, unadulterated awe in it. Colonel, you're not going to believe this. That was Pedro Nurse. One shot. Thorne felt a jolt, as if the floor had dropped out from under him. He leaned closer to the screen, his mind refusing to process the information. A nurse, a flight nurse from a helicopter bucking in a sandstorm, had just made a shot that a Tier 1 sniper would be proud to claim on a calm day at the range. It was impossible. It defied doctrine. It defied logic. It defied everything he knew about the neat, orderly boxes he put his soldiers in. And yet, the gun was silent. The proof was right there, painted in the stark pixels of the drone feed. The enemy, momentarily shocked by the sudden loss of their most powerful weapon, recovered quickly. They were professionals, not conscripts. Realizing a high-threat sniper was in the air, they changed tactics. A new sound joined the cacophony of the battle, the hollow, terrifying thump-thump-thump of a mortar tube. Seconds later, a plume of dirt and rock erupted 50 meters from Reaper 3's position. They were walking the rounds in. Mortar! The Reaper team leader yelled over the radio. They're zeroing in on us from the western slope. I see it, Diaz confirmed, swinging his optics. It's concealed in a wash, behind a rock shelf. Can't get a clean look at it. The helicopter was now the enemy's primary target. The remaining machine guns opened up, their tracers reaching for the sky. Mills had to jink and dive, throwing the Pave Hawk across the sky in a series of violent, evasive maneuvers. The cabin became a gravity-defying cage. For anyone trying to aim a rifle, it was an impossible situation. Another mortar round landed, this time closer, showering Reaper's position with shrapnel. We can't stay here, the co-pilot shouted. We're a sitting duck. Get me an angle on that mortar, Sharma's voice commanded, as calm as if she were asking for a weather report. Mills, I need you to drop altitude and give me a lateral pass, west to east, across the valley mouth. As low as you dare. You're insane, Griggs yelled from the back. They'll hose us down. Do it, Mills, Sharma said, ignoring him. Doing it, Mills replied, his trust now absolute. He banked the helicopter so hard that the horizon tilted to 90 degrees, then plunged toward the valley floor. The ground rushed up to meet them. The airframe groaned in protest. Machine gun fire raked the sky where they had been moments before. In the TOC, Thorne watched the helicopter's icon on the holographic map perform the maneuver. It was a move of breathtaking recklessness, a textbook violation of every rule for operating in a high-threat environment. "What is that pilot doing?" he roared into his microphone. "He's taking them right into the kill box." "He's giving his shooter an angle, sir," the Ops SGM said quietly, his eyes glued to the drone feed. He, too, was beginning to understand that he was witnessing something far outside the established rules of engagement. Thorne fell silent, his anger replaced by a tense, unwilling fascination. He was watching his rigid world of doctrine and procedure be dismantled, shot, by a woman he had dismissed as irrelevant. His doubt was now locked in a mortal struggle with the undeniable facts unfolding on his screen. "Keep that feed live," he ordered, his voice low and tight. "I want to see this." He gave an order he never thought he would give, trusting an unknown variable over his own experienced judgment. "Pedro 6-1, you are cleared to engage at will. Prosecute all targets of opportunity. Keep Reaper alive." The Pave Hawk screamed across the valley, 100 feet off the deck. The speed was dizzying. Rocks and scrub brush were a brown-green blur. The mortar team, hidden in their wash, saw them coming and frantically tried to traverse their tube. They were exposed for just a moment. For Sharma, the world was a high-speed tracking problem. She was braced against the door frame, the wind a solid wall of force against her. She wasn't fighting the speed. She was using it. The lateral movement of the helicopter was a known variable, a constant she could factor into her firing solution. She tracked the mortar position, her scope a steady anchor in the streaking landscape. The mortar crew, 3 men, fumbled with a round. She didn't fire 3 shots. She fired 1. She didn't aim for any of the men. She aimed for the stack of mortar rounds beside them. The 762mm round, traveling at over 2,500 feet per second, crossed the 600-meter distance in a heartbeat. It struck the top shell in the neat pyramid of ordnance. The result was catastrophic. A secondary explosion, a brilliant, violent flower of fire and black smoke, blossomed from the wash. The shockwave hit the helicopter a second later, a solid punch of concussive force that made the entire airframe shudder. The mortar position, and the men who had manned it, ceased to exist. The immediate threats were gone, but the most dangerous one remained. From a high, almost inaccessible perch on the northern ridge, a single rifle began to fire with chilling precision. The rounds weren't wild bursts of automatic fire. They were single, well-aimed shots that chipped away at Reaper's cover with methodical patience. An enemy sniper. He was good. He was using the chaotic wind, firing in the lulls, his position a mere shadow in a jumble of rocks that made him nearly invisible. "I can't see him," Diaz said, frustration plain in his voice as he scanned the ridge. "He's in a crow's nest. Perfect cover and concealment." "He's using the wind shadow created by the main peak," Sharma observed. The sniper was smart. He'd chosen a position that was not only fortified but also aerodynamically complex, making a long-range shot against him a gambler's throw. The helicopter couldn't get a stable firing angle without exposing its belly to the remaining ground fire. "I can't hold us steady enough for that shot, Captain," Mills said, his voice grim. "The turbulence up there is a nightmare." Sharma looked at the ridge, her eyes narrowed in concentration. She wasn't looking at the sniper's nest. She was looking at the rock formation above it. A massive, precariously balanced slab of granite, weathered by 1,000 years of wind and ice. It hung over the sniper's position like a stone guillotine. She saw a solution, not a better shot but a different one. A move of brutal geological elegance. "Mills," she said, her voice dropping, taking on a new, urgent intensity. "Take us lower. Edge of the rotor wash. I want you to put the bird right in the wind shear off that peak. It's going to get rough." "You want me to fly into the shear?" the co-pilot asked, incredulous. "It could tear a blade off." "Trust me," Sharma said. "I need the updraft. I'm not shooting at him." Mills didn't hesitate. "You heard her." Taking us down, he expertly maneuvered the Pave Hawk, descending into the most treacherous air in the valley. The helicopter began to shake violently, not just bucking, but vibrating with a high-frequency intensity that resonated through the deck plates. Alarms screamed in the cockpit. Felt like the machine was being torn apart. Sharma leaned far out into the maelstrom, tethered by her harness. The updraft was a physical blow, trying to rip the rifle from her hands. She locked her arms, becoming a statue of iron and will. She aimed, not at the shadow of the sniper, but at a small fissure in the rock formation a dozen feet above him. It was a target no bigger than a dinner plate. She accounted for the violent vibration, the insane wind, the helicopter's groaning protest. Her mind became a supercomputer of ballistics and instinct. She fired. The bullet, her special, hand-loaded round, screamed across the gap. It wasn't intended to kill a man, but to move a mountain. The round struck the rock, not with a simple chip, but with a sharp crack that echoed across the valley. The high-velocity impact, combined with the bullet's design, transferred a massive amount of kinetic energy into the stressed granite. For a silent, breathless second, nothing happened. Then, with a deep, grinding groan, the fissure widened. A web of cracks spread across the rock face. The massive slab of granite shifted, tilted, and then fell. Tons of rock slid down the mountainside in a slow-motion avalanche of dust and destruction. It didn't just hit the sniper's nest. It obliterated it, scouring the cliff face clean and burying the position under a tomb of shattered stone. The enemy sniper was gone, erased from the battlefield by an act of weaponized geology. In the sudden, profound silence, Reaper 3's leader came on the radio. His voice was choked with emotion. Jesus, God, Pedro 6-1, the LZ is clear. I say again, the LZ is clear. On our way, Mills said, his own voice shaky with adrenaline and disbelief. He pulled the Pave Hawk out of the turbulent air and swooped toward the beleaguered team's position. The extraction was a model of desperate efficiency. As the helicopter settled into a low hover, kicking up a blinding cloud of dust and debris, Diaz rappelled down with the rescue hoist. Sharma, still at the door, provided cover. Her role had shifted from sniper to guardian. The rifle was no longer a tool of surgical removal, but a shield. She scanned the ridges, her eyes missing nothing. Twice, enemy fighters, driven by desperation or fury, broke cover from the lower slopes, attempting to charge the landing zone. They never got more than a few steps. 2 precise shots, fired with an almost casual economy, dropped them in their tracks. She wasn't wasting ammunition. She was deconstructing their morale, shot by single, perfectly placed shot. She created a sterile bubble of lethality around the rescue operation, a zone where any hostile movement was met with instant and final consequence. Diaz worked fast on the ground, rigging the wounded PJ first, then the captured asset, and finally the team leader. One by one, they were hoisted up into the relative safety of the cabin. Sharma never took her eye off the scope, her finger resting lightly on the trigger, until Diaz himself was back on board and the ramp was coming up. "We have them all," Diaz shouted over the diminishing gunfire. "Let's go." Mills needed no encouragement. He pulled collective, and the Pave Hawk surged into the sky, leaving the blood-soaked rocks and the silenced valley behind as it raced the storm back to the safety of the FOB. The flight back was quiet. The rescued PJs were in shock, their faces smeared with grime and blood, their eyes wide with a mixture of exhaustion and awe. They kept looking at Sharma, who was now calmly field-stripping the M110A1 on the floor, her movements as precise and unhurried as they had been when she was assembling it. She was no longer just the flight nurse. She was something else entirely, something they didn't have a name for. The Pave Hawk touched down on the tarmac at FOB Dagger just as the first heavy sheets of rain began to fall, washing the dust from the air. The doors flew open and a medical team rushed forward with stretchers. The base was a hive of activity, but all of it seemed to orbit the returned helicopter. Colonel Marcus Thorne stood waiting on the wet tarmac, his uniform immaculate despite the weather. His face was unreadable, a mask of stone. He watched as the wounded were carefully offloaded. He watched the two surviving members of Reaper 3 limp out of the cabin, supporting each other. Then he watched Captain Anya Sharma step out. She carried the rifle in its case, her flight suit soaked, her face etched with fatigue but otherwise impassive. The Reaper team leader, a grizzled master sergeant with a fresh gash on his forehead, saw Colonel Thorne. He straightened up, ignoring his injuries. He then turned his gaze to Sharma. He took a half-step forward, his eyes locking with hers. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. He brought his hand up in a slow, deliberate salute. It was a gesture of profound, battlefield-forged respect, a warrior's acknowledgement of another. The other surviving PJ immediately followed his lead, his salute just as crisp. The other crew members of Pedro 6-1, Diaz, Griggs, and the pilots, who had gathered by the nose of the aircraft, all turned and rendered their own salutes to the quiet captain. They were no longer saluting her rank. They were saluting the woman who had walked through fire with them and brought them all home. Thorne watched the scene, his jaw tight. The rigid framework of his world had been irrevocably shattered. Rank, protocol, specialty codes, they all seemed like meaningless abstractions in the face of what he had just witnessed. He walked forward, his boots splashing in the puddles on the tarmac, and stopped directly in front of Sharma. He looked from her face down to the rifle case, then back up. His eyes, for the first time, lingered on the small, faded patch on her sleeve, the single raven's feather. A flicker of recognition, of dawning comprehension, crossed his face. He'd seen that sigil before, years ago, in a heavily redacted after-action report from Kandahar province. A report that spoke of a solo operative, a ghost who had dismantled an entire insurgent network with a handful of impossible shots, an operative whose file was sealed at the highest levels. The report had called her Corvus, the Raven. He had dismissed it as a battlefield myth, an exaggerated legend. "The ghost of Kandahar," Thorne said, the words quiet, almost a whisper against the drumming rain. It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact. Sharma met his gaze, her expression unchanging. She simply gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod. Thorne held her gaze for a long moment. The dismissive colonel was gone, replaced by a commander who had just been given a harsh but necessary lesson. He took a deep breath, the damp air feeling clean in his lungs. "Your file," he said, "is going to need a significant update." He then raised his own hand and delivered a sharp, perfect salute. "Welcome back to the fight, Captain." Sharma simply nodded again, accepting the gesture with the same quiet dignity with which she did everything else. The moment passed. The legend had returned, not with a thunderous announcement, but in the quiet competence of a job well done. Hours later, the storm had passed, leaving the air washed clean and cool. The base was quiet, the adrenaline of the day's events having subsided into a weary calm. In the vast, echoing space of the main hangar, under the sterile glare of the overhead lights, Anya Sharma sat on a simple wooden crate. The M110A1 rifle was completely disassembled on a clean canvas cloth before her. Each piece, the bolt carrier group, the trigger assembly, the firing pin, was laid out in perfect order. She cleaned each component with meticulous care, her hands moving with a surgeon's precision. The smell of gun oil and solvent hung in the air, a familiar, almost comforting incense. This was her ritual, the process that allowed her to compartmentalize the violence of her work, to separate the operator from the nurse. It was a way of honoring the tool, of resetting herself to a state of quiet readiness. The cold, clean steel felt solid and real under her fingertips. Sergeant Diaz approached quietly, walking softly so as not to break the spell. He held 2 steaming mugs of coffee. He stopped a few feet away, unsure if he should speak. She didn't look up, but she knew he was there. "They're calling you a hero, you know," he said softly. "The Reaper guys. They said they've never seen anything like it." Sharma continued her work, wiping down the barrel with a long cleaning rod. "I'm not a hero," she said, her voice low and even. "I was just the tool that was available for the job." "That first shot," Diaz pressed, unable to let it go. 800 meters. From a moving platform in a crosswind. "Nobody makes that shot." She paused, looking at the reflection of the hangar lights on the polished surface of the bolt. "My grandfather always said you don't fight the wind," she murmured, her voice distant, as if quoting a sacred text. "You don't command it. You listen to it. You let it tell you where the bullet needs to go." She looked up at him then, and he saw not the cold operator from the helicopter, but a woman with old, tired eyes. "The rest is just breathing." He didn't know what to say to that. He simply stepped forward and placed one of the coffee mugs on the crate beside her. "Well," he said, "thank you." She gave him a small, fleeting smile, the first he had ever seen. "You're welcome, Sergeant." Diaz nodded and retreated, leaving her to her solitude. Sharma picked up the warm mug, its heat a small comfort against the hangar's chill. She stared at her own reflection, distorted in the curved lens of the rifle's scope. It was just a face, a woman who had once been a ghost, who had tried to become a healer, and who had learned today that she would always be both. The dust of the Sharkawi Range still seemed to cling to her, a faint, ghostly powder on her flight suit. She finished reassembling the rifle, the final click of the magazine seating into place a sound of finality. She placed the weapon gently back into its case and closed the lid. Her work was done. Outside, the low hum of a C-130 taxiing for a midnight flight broke the silence. Another mission, another flight, another day. Her dignity was in her silence, her honor in her competence. And in the quiet hum of the waiting engines, there was a promise that she would be ready when she was needed again.